The Foreign Service is America's first line of defense. We have interests all over the world. Those interests need to be pursued, they need to be protected, they need to be expanded. And the diplomatic service, the Foreign Service, Civil Service, the State Department, all of the people who work in the agency are given this task by the American people to make sure that America is strong, that America is great, and that we're ready for the next opportunity. And so the Director General has the great good fortune to be involved in recruiting the wonderful people who will be in the Foreign Service in the future, to taking care of the people who are in the Foreign Service today and make sure that they have the best experience possible, and very importantly as well to honor the people who served in the Foreign Service and served in the State Department so that they, as they retire, continue to be ambassadors for diplomacy, but also get the respect that they deserve for their great service. American Foreign Service, again, is a front line on the American economy. I can remember when I was an ambassador abroad, one of the most important jobs I had was taking American businesses who would come to Turkey, where I was the ambassador, and they'd be looking for opportunities. Where can we invest? What can we sell? Can we make a partnership with a Turkish company? And so our embassy was heavily engaged in making sure that American business, American products, American investment were part of the conversation all around the world. It's one of the things that I think has been most exciting over the last few years, that our younger officers have taken this really as a big responsibility and have made it a big part of the Foreign Service. And I think if you were to interview people in business today, what would they say? They'd say that when they go knock on a door of an embassy for help, they get it. And that's something we can really be proud of. I was very lucky. I went to the University of California at Santa Barbara. I was there 3 years. And like a lot of people, I had a great mentor. And he said, you know, your education at UC Santa Barbara is great, but what you really need is to get some knowledge of the world. And he put me into the Education Abroad program by the University of California, and I had the good fortune to live a year in England, and I got the bug. I got the bug for travel. I got the bug for being interested in how other people organize their lives. And I really wanted to represent the United States someday. And I came back to California after my year, and I said, I have to find some way to get back into that business. And lucky for me, I took the Foreign Service exam, got in, and 29 years later came out the other end and loved every day of it. Well, U.S. embassies are targets for terrorists because terrorists are terrorists. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to instill fear in people, and they look for targets that they know will garner publicity. They look for targets where they think that they can drive us out because we'll be fearful in the future. And I think the history of American diplomacy, and certainly these last few years, have been the great courage of Foreign Service people and our locally engaged staff very much as well, who said, no, we're not going to be forced out of these places. We are going to continue to represent the United States of America. It's a really big challenge. I mean, when I joined the Foreign Service, yes, there was risk, but when you compare it to what we ask people to do today, and the number of places we ask people to go where they can't take their families, they can't take their children, they're restricted in some way. You know, I worked for a couple of years on Afghanistan and Pakistan, and my goodness, the sacrifice that people made to serve in those places for the American people was enormous. And what we found, I think, after 9/11 is that if you don't engage, what happens? Well, a lot of bad things happen. And so people still need to be out there. They need to be at the embassy, and not in the embassy, but out into society. And once you're out into society, you're taking a risk. And I think the American people know that, but I hope that they really respect it. Well, this question of balance is a really important one. I am in favor of risk management rather than risk avoidance. I don't think you can avoid all risk and do your job as a diplomat. But you can manage that risk, and that risk is managed by good training, by safety, by a package of equipment or a package of people who might be able to help you depending on your rank. So you can manage risk, but I don't think you should avoid it. And I think the American people, as I say, understand that pretty well. They know that in this world there are going to be, God forbid, some diplomatic casualties. And I think that's just the truth. And one of the things that the diplomatic service knows and the Foreign Service knows is that's part of the job today. But if you're going to represent the United States, there's a certain amount of risk involved. I did, but just very briefly, and I know her story, and again, it's a perfect example of that, and she paid the ultimate price for representing the United States of America. Well, the war in the Balkans was terrible. When you go back now and look at the casualty figures, enormous numbers of people died, so many people were injured, but also I think really importantly, beyond just the loss of life and the terrible suffering, it was really a threat to the kind of order that people were looking for in Europe. One of the things that I think many administrations have adopted is this phrase, a Europe whole, free, and at peace. And you couldn't have a Europe whole, free, and at peace if the Balkans were in flames. And so as the former Yugoslavia broke apart, all of the things that were internal tensions in that society burst into flames, really. And of course, you look back, as I say, the history was a terrible one, and it took an enormous amount of effort, an enormous amount of responsibility, and a fair amount of military force to bring it to an end. But the diplomacy there, especially as pursued by Dick Holbrooke, was an enormous part of that story. And I think one of the great pieces of diplomatic triumph for the United States, certainly since the end of World War II. Well, it's a history of things. You have to go back really and think about a whole series of events. We were involved at the end of a time when I happened to be in Turkey the first time in trying to do a humanitarian effort to save the Kurds after the first Gulf War. Well, people thought what they'd learned at that time was, well, let's apply that to other situations. It didn't work nearly as well in Somalia, for example. People were hesitant about what to do, therefore, in Rwanda. And so by the time it got to the Balkans, there was a lot of confusion about what the right mixture of action and observation was. But I think after Srebrenica, after some of the really terrible events in the Balkans, President Clinton, Secretary Christopher realized, Secretary Albright realized that really the time had come to act. And that's what we did, and I think that's what Dick Holbrooke led in trying to bring together the Dayton Peace Accords. Well, Dick, of course, was a Foreign Service officer as a young man, served in Vietnam, left the service because he just was profoundly disturbed by our policies there. I then had a chance to meet him when he was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs and pursuing this effort in the Balkans. I had the good fortune at that time to be the ambassador to Turkey. And as you know, a lot of the initial negotiations about Dayton took place in my living room in Turkey because that's where Mr. Izetbegovic felt comfortable in coming, and the Turks were very supportive of the effort that Dick was making. So we worked very closely together during that time. And then afterwards, also during the time I was in Turkey, he was very interested in two things that were crucial to my policy at that time. One was to see if we couldn't move the Turks into the European Union Customs Union, not the European Union, but the Customs Union. And he was just a huge supporter of that effort. And also, he made a very big effort to see if there were any possibilities in trying to solve the Cyprus problem. Again, something that has bedeviled American diplomats for a lot of years, and he put an enormous amount of energy into that, and I admired it. I don't know, I recall reading that it was outside of Washington, D.C., so that they were able to control a little bit more of the environment. There was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, again to control some of the environment, and I think it got everybody there to focus on the job at hand, and they weren't rushing out to do the kinds of things that you do in Washington. They were focused on the job, and I think it was very smart to choose some place, not completely isolated. I don't mean to say that Dayton's an isolated place, but they were on an Air Force base, they were in the center of the country, they had this job to do. Well, I think one of the things that was true about Dick all through his life, and it was certainly true during the time that he was the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, was that Dick Holbrooke looked at suffering and said, we ought to be able to stop this. He looked at diplomatic problems and said, we ought to be able to do something about this. And one of the things that I hope people in the United States will recognize is that by and large, people who join the Foreign Service are interested in doing something. And people see problems, they want to solve them. But he was really a leader in that. And so if you think about his whole life, I mean, Dayton is one example, but you know, the years that he was out of government, what did he do? You know, he formed that coalition, partnership with business to see if they could do something about AIDS. Big, big, very important issue. And again, you know, when the call came to be the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, he said yes, and you know, ended up dying in that office. And so he was just one of these people who got up in the morning and said, what am I supposed to do today? What can I do today to make things different? You know, we've always tried to live by a philosophy, and I hope, you know, he wouldn't mind if I put some words in his mouth, you know, to say it doesn't have to be this way. It can be some other way. And if you take that as your philosophy, then you live your life like he did, and a life that others have tried to emulate. Well, he was himself. You know, he was highly intelligent. And one of the things that I admired most about Dick was the way he could bring together what looked to other people like very disparate things. You know, how does this connect it to this? And he was able to bring these things together. I guess the modern phrase is, you know, he was good at connecting the dots. He was really good at connecting the dots, and I admired that very much about him. And as I say, he got up every morning and said, let's do something here today. Let's not hang around, let's do something. Well, shuttle diplomacy is that diplomacy where the negotiator, whether it be Henry Kissinger during the Middle East peace talks, or Dick Holbrooke, or others who've tried this technique, I realized that for a time anyway, they're not going to be able to bring the parties to a conflict together face to face. So you shuttle back and forth. So I go to see you, I hear from you what it is that you want, I go to see the other person in this negotiation, I tell them about your position, I hear theirs, I go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the goal is, of course, as he did, was to bring finally everybody together to Dayton. And so, as I say, you know, my limited part of this was that a lot of the negotiation of the shuttle, I guess at least for the Izetbegovic side, for the Bosnians, was the best place to do it was in my living room in Accra. And so I got to see one piece of it. They'd get on the airplane and head someplace else, try to make arrangements with other people, and ultimately brought everybody together to Dayton. The outcome of Dayton was an end to killing. And that was a really important thing. You know, people, I had the good fortune, one person removed, but I became the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs after Dick. And one of my responsibilities was to implement the Dayton Accords. And we spent an enormous amount of time at this because we knew that if we get them implemented, less people would die. And you know, sometimes that's what it comes down to. And nothing's perfect, and yes, there are still challenges in the Balkans. But when you think about the effect of Dayton in terms of the number of people who have been saved, the number of people who are still alive, the number of people who aren't dead, well, it's a big accomplishment. And it was one of the things that really kind of helped us think through the action we took in 1999 in Kosovo. One of the big challenges in the Foreign Service today is, as you say, making sure that you can hire the best people and then keep them. And what that means today, in terms of keeping the best people, is 3 or 4 things. One is that people in this generation who are joining the Foreign Service today, they demand a higher standard and a higher level of professional education. They think that employers, and I think they're right, they think that employers have a responsibility to do some professional education. And so there's been a revolution in that in the Foreign Service, and that's a very good thing. Second, as you can imagine, because society has changed so much, people are going abroad and their spouses are working, and they have professions, and they want to pursue them. And so one of the things that's very important in terms of retention is making it possible for spouses to continue to be employed. And there's lots of ways to do that. Some people work online. We've negotiated dozens and dozens of employment agreements with other countries so people can work abroad. But that's a very important part of anybody's job today in terms of retention. And then third, and won't surprise you, is people are interested in their security and their health and their kids' education. And so those are the same kind of things you'd be interested in wherever you live, but they're magnified when you live overseas. So all of those things have to do with retention. One of the things that we notice about people in the Foreign Service is they join because they want to serve. They join because they want to be part of something that's happening. And people, as you can see, are prepared to put up with tremendous sacrifice in order to keep that profession. I mean, think of the number of people today compared to when I joined the Foreign Service who are at posts where their families can't serve. You know, dozens and dozens of posts now where it's not safe, but people go anyway. Think of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who served in Afghanistan. Not once, not twice, but sometimes 3 times. Same with Iraq. No families there, but people are prepared to do this for the pursuit of the national interest. Foreign Service has done a better job over the past few years in being a diverse representative of the United States of America, but there's still a lot of work to do. I think we've done the best on terms of gender balance. There are lots more women in the Foreign Service today. Some entering classes are over 50% women, more women at senior positions. But there still need to be a lot more African Americans in the Foreign Service, and especially Hispanic Americans. And so I think the Foreign Service will continue to make that effort. It's important that the Foreign Service look like the United States, but there's still some work to do. Well, the Foreign Service is changing in front of our very eyes because diplomacy is changing in front of our very eyes. You know, if you think back to 100 or 150 years ago, people were, waiting for the ship to come in to see what their instructions were. Or even when I joined the Foreign Service, what was our job? Our job when I joined the Foreign Service was to observe and report, send information back to Washington, D.C. so that other people could make decisions about what to do next. Now, what do we ask people to do today? We ask people to promote sustainable development, to promote democracy, stop the trafficking in women and children, work on counter-narcotics, all kinds of things that are frontline, active things to do. And I think that's what's so exciting to be in the Foreign Service today. I tell new Foreign Service officers, I envy them. Because 30 years from now, whoever is sitting here giving this interview, they'll have had a career unlike anything I can even imagine. So I think the excitement of it is that they're going to be pioneers in something very different. I mean, some things will be the same. There'll be interactions with governments. There'll be interactions with people. There'll be, as we were talking about with Dick Holbrooke, the really important effort to solve problems, but in a wholly new way. And I think that's a very exciting thing. So the challenge for the Foreign Service is to keep up with the way the world is changing, keep up with these trends, and to properly represent the United States. Consular services are the first line of defense in many ways. And I'll give you 2 answers to that question. One, of course, is that it is our consular officers abroad who really are making that decision about whether people can come or not come to the United States of America. So what do we expect of them? We expect first that they keep bad people out, but also very importantly that we keep our doors open so that good people can come in. We talked a little bit earlier about the questions of commerce and the economy. Well, think about what tourism dollars are spent in the United States of America. So we want people to come to our country. We want them to see what's here. We want them to spend their money here, but we want to make sure that the negative people stay out. The other thing I think that's really important about consular officers, and again, I tell this to new Foreign Service officers, is who supervises more people earlier in their career? Consular officers. Who's got more interaction on a day-to-day basis with the local, the host population? Consular officers. Who gets to use their language probably more than anybody else in the embassy at an earlier age? Consular officers. And so this experience is a tremendously important one. And there's a third point, and that is American citizen services. When I was the ambassador to Turkey, I didn't get any letters from members of Congress saying, oh, your political reporting is wonderful, but I sure got a letter that said, Mr. and Ms. So-and-so, they lost their passport in Istanbul, and bam, they went to the consulate and they got another one, and how pleased they were with the service, how pleased they were with the way they were treated. And so American citizen services, also extremely important. So this consular work, which of course is in the Constitution, that's the thing that diplomats are supposed to do, is an enormously important part of the profession. Well, the work of consular officers has been emphasized since 9/11 because the 9/11 perpetrators, they got visas. And so one of the things that we ask people abroad now is to be careful. One of the most important parts of that is that the people in the front of this line have all the information that they need. You know, one of the shocking things about 9/11 was that there was information that would have, had it been in the consular officers' hands, made it impossible for some of these people to get visas in the first place. And so providing our frontline forces, consular officers in this case, with the right information so they can make the right decisions is really important. But we look to them to say, you are the first line of defense as we try to protect the homeland. Well, we hope that more and more people will join the Foreign Service. One of the good things about the entry exam and the entry process is there's no specific major, no specific path that we ask people to take. What we're interested in is smart people, people who are curious, people who want to represent their country abroad. And if you've been an English major, a political science major, or have a law degree, all that's fine. It's the personality type we're looking for. Someone who's going to be proud to represent the United States, active in representing the United States. The diplomacy part of it is something I think, anyway, that the State Department has a responsibility to teach people, just as we teach people languages. So we don't expect people to come in and be diplomats already. How could you possibly do that? But what we expect people is to come in and want to have the joy of this life abroad, the joy of making decisions, and the joy of representing the United States. Well, one of the most important things that we have learned, really since Colin Powell was Secretary of State, is that professional education is a hugely important part of both forming and then retaining people in the Foreign Service. And when you go to see the Foreign Service Institute, you'll see a tribute to George Shultz, Shultz Center. Why is that? Because he put the money in the budget all those years ago to say, we are going to have a world-class training facility for our officers. And that's what they do. What's really changed there over the years is it used to be mostly an emphasis on language training or regional training. And fair enough, you know, we're trying to get ready for people to go serve in country X or country Y or country Z. But what you'll find at the Foreign Service Institute today is really an emphasis on leadership training. Taking people who come into the Foreign Service, they spend 10 or 15 years in their careers, and then they have to get ready to lead people. And you know, you're not born with those skills, or I'm sure some people are. I wasn't born with such a skill. You can learn these skills to be a leader. And one of the great things the Foreign Service Institute has done over the past 10 or 15 years is focused in on this question of leadership training. And I think they've done a terrific job. There's still more to do, don't get me wrong, but that building, that institution, what they do there is something that people at the State Department are enormously proud of.